But Matt, why don't you set us up here, because we wanted to talk a little bit about the shifts that we're seeing in politics from the Democratic Party and in politics in general. But you sort of set us up well with that intro video with that ghoul Jay Carney, or for folks who don't remember, that was Obama's press secretary, who then went on to have a very profitable career working for Amazon, most recently spending time maligning and attacking workers in Amazon facilities who were trying to make sure that they had the basic protections from COVID-19. So a great tradition in the Obama administration there.
Yeah, I mean it's the ultimate low bar, really, right? In order for Joe Biden to be an acceptable president in terms of labor, he needs to be way better than Obama was. And to that, and so, and we're in a different era, right? Like we're going to talk about this a lot. We're in an era that's much less austere. We're not talking about Reinhardt and Rogoff and stuff like that anymore, right? um, the Republicans spent in the CARES Act. I mean, a lot of it went to corporations, but right, they also put a dent in childhood poverty, for instance, right? So there's and we talked about this with Matt Karp last week, the difference between material politics and class politics, which is at this point in terms of class politics absolutely incomplete for Joe Biden, right? What could be sort of structural in the most recent stimulus is the childhood allowance. Why that's incomplete is because it remains to be seen if Democrats are going to force that to be a permanent part of our welfare state. So we'll see. And then there's these things we're going to talk about. We're going to emphasize the PRO Act, and also the thing that was removed, which so you get an incomplete minus, was the $15 minimum wage. And why was that the one thing removed? Just because it was structural, right? That's the massively structural change. And so will Democrats do this? Structural became like a code, a buzzword among elite Democrats. Like, we're going to do big structural change.
Yeah.
Well, let's define what those are. And in terms of labor, it's a $15 and it's the PRO Act. And in terms of democracy, it's HR1. And so there's this good article here I want to share. Just came out today by Brandon Magner, Jacobin, and it brings it down to the filibuster. You need to get rid of the filibuster if you're going to do anything on this. Now, I appreciate Brandon, the tone of this can actually happen, right? Like, there's actually been more rumblings that maybe you wouldn't expect, that there will be support to returning to the talking filibuster, which means that a senator will have to stay up there and, actually occupy the podium or whatever. And I think I don't think Lindsey Graham, I think it will have a fundamentally big effect on the Senate business. I think it's definitely something that I would get rid of the filibuster entirely. This really is just returning the filibuster to what people's conception of the filibuster should be. But they should definitely do it. And I am encouraged that they're tying it to the PRO Act and HR1. And that they're willing to take on those fights. And I think they should be encouraged in that. But I think the other thing is I like news cycles and, giving plaudits for doing the right things. Because the truth is, like, Bessemer, my understanding is Biden's words have actually had a really solid effect there. Yeah. And so maybe it was just good that he didn't promise to actually go there himself. And so, like, it's there. And these are just the things, like, how structural is it, right? Like, and that is still what remains to be seen entirely. And so I think, like, all these questions of is it a return to anything, or what era of economics are we in? It kind of remains to be seen.
Yeah. And it's been interesting over these past couple of weeks. Like, so this show is still fairly young, and we very much have been, as a project, have been sort of interacting with this early period of the Biden administration, what that means for left-wing politics. One of the big stories that we were focused on early on was how timid Biden and a lot of the Democrats were on the stimulus, particularly on the amount of money that they were going to be providing to people. And I think it is something that is still important to note, that they had all the potential in the world to increase those payments to folks and to make sure that people understand that those are tactical and political decisions from the Biden administration, which actively just take money out of working people's pockets, right? But let's put that aside for a second, because the way that Marxists and and socialists and materialists view politics in this current historical moment is going to be very different from like a kind of liberal pundit, not just because of like orientation, but because of the way that you're viewing the field that politics, the theater that politics is happening on, right? And what do I mean by that? It's like, you've seen since this stimulus has gone into effect, there's been a lot of gushing in liberal media over the stimulus, mainly doing that thing that they always do, which say like, oh, wow, he's FDR now, right? Look, it's certainly not that. It really, really is not that kind of structural change that we saw in FDR. And again, FDR ain't some kind of radical socialist or anything like that. That was just kind of like basic social democracy kind of programs in the United States, right? But they're already, sort of playing up this, this story around the stimulus. And I think, as Matt Carpenter and a lot of other people have noted, it seems like there's actually been a shift across the board. The Republicans also put forward a massive stimulus as well, right? And still very early in the Biden administration, but more when it comes down to dollars and cents than what happened in this most recent stimulus package as well, right? So this whole like nonsense that you're seeing from folks are saying like, oh, Biden is going to be the most progressive president ever. And then they love to throw in this kind of thing like, I'm talking about liberal pundits, by the way. Like, Biden's going to be the most progressive president ever. And it's going to be by accident. And it's only because all of these like left movements of the Bernie campaign pushed him left. And it's like, I'm sorry. We're seeing very clearly that that's not going to be the case either. Right. And when it comes to anyone being a progressive, looking at how much Biden is willing to, one, continue the militarization of the United States border and continuing to ratchet up pressure against China and Bolivia and all of these other governments around the world, that should just disqualify him from being considered a progressive, squishy of a word as that is, by anybody. Right. But it has to be noted like that. We're in this moment right now where they did put this stimulus in that does, as Matt was saying, does some things that are going to help stop the bleeding, right? Providing people with, money, these credits for families, that is a positive program, right? Childhood poverty is a massive cause of poverty in the United States, right? That's something that's worth addressing. But, and as Matt was noting earlier, the fact that it's not permanent, should reveal to people that what happened here was not Biden and the Democrats waking up one day and saying, oh, you know what, it's finally time for us to stand up for the working class of America. They did it because we are living through a pandemic whose economic effects are still hitting everyday people in extreme ways.
Yeah, important to note that Mitt Romney also had a very generous childhood poverty policy.
And if you don't mind pulling up Matt Carp's piece real quick, there's a section that I want to read from. But everyone should go through Matt Carp's piece, that he teased last week on the show. No, Joe Biden won't give us social democracy. And it's a really good piece because it's not just him saying like, oh, well, look, a socialist plan would be so much more radical or anything like that. Of course, that's the case. But Matt actually makes a much stronger structural critique of what we're seeing with this stimulus and how like the left should be thinking about it. So I'll just read this section from it. For all the huzzas about progress toward American social democracy, it is hard to see how anything here even begins to alter the social relations between worker and boss, citizen and state, labor and capital. There is a reason why 170 business leaders, including CEOs of Goldman Sachs, Google, Lyft, Siemens, Visa, and Zillow, and Vox Media too, released a letter supporting the package. The one provision in the House bill that did challenge the preferences of some business leaders, the $15 an hour minimum wage, was dispatched in the Senate without any countervailing pressure from top Democrats, right? This is a critical point. This stimulus bill will help people, right? You have to do it, actually. And that's why you're seeing the wealthy, and even some like the Republicans look, they're not supporting it, they're not voting for it, but they sure as hell are going to their constituents and acting like they influenced it, especially the more popular aspects of it, right? There is a shift that's happening, and it's a shift that is happening because of massive crisis and realignment in global capital that started in the 2008 financial crisis, right? This is an important point. And there's another really great essay that I think people should check out in Damage Magazine called Is the Left to Thank for the Stimulus by Dominic King, which is just worth checking out because, he's sort of pushing back on this notion that this happened because, the left is, pushing Biden left, right? What we're seeing is not some kind of like ideological victory for the left. What we're seeing right now is there's a stimulus that has some good provisions in it, right? Not perfect. And we'll get into some of those in a second, is going out not because some kind of ideological debate has been won, but because this stimulus is needed to keep this thing going. And I'm talking about capitalism, and I'm talking about the exploitation of wage laborers across the country. We live in a society that's very much dependent on consumers. And when you look at the unequal distribution of income, has already existed pre-pandemic, but only got worse, right, over this past year. You have to give some money to people to make sure that this system has some oil, right?
Yeah.
That it can keep chugging along, right? We noted again that some of the better things in this are time limited, and then when it came to actual more structural aspects of the bill, like $15 an hour minimum wage, right, those were thrown out. Think about and so I'm making this point because we need to sort of take a second as the left and as socialists, as we are trying to reorient ourselves in a political landscape that is different, especially from the last 4 years under Trump, but is also going to be different because we don't have the same kind of reliance or on the Bernie campaign, presidential campaign, to focus our interests. Like we have to start thinking about what we're going to do, and that also means that we need to start um, reinterpreting the world around us, right? Doing that kind of structural analysis because people have learned a playbook of kind of criticism of the Democratic Party that it will definitely be true in the top sense, like the Democratic Party doesn't stand up for workers, right? But the tactics that the Democratic Party uses are going to change, right? So think about something like Medicare for all, and why that's different from a kind of like stimulus program. Medicare for all is a non-reformist reform because it takes a huge sector of our society out of the claws of private hands, right, and brings that into the public domain. That's a structural shift, right? So again, it's great. It's preferable for our system when it comes to healthcare to provide subsidies for poor people versus nothing, but that doesn't alter the dynamic of a private health insurance industry that is just sucking up income from folks and also limiting people's access to healthcare. Not to mention the structural power that bosses then have to be able to use access to healthcare as as a tool in the negotiation room, right?
Mhm.
So moving that system away from that kind of that private system, right, where it is run for the interests of like the bourgeoisie, the wealthy, the capitals, your boss, right, and moving that into a public domain, that is a victory. And that's like something that we need to like really be understanding, especially when it comes to things like even cash payments, right? We want to be trying to claw back as socialists as much of this of the things that are needed to survive and how the things that are needed to just live an enjoyable life, god forbid, pleasurable or one with a little bit of leisure, right? We want to be pulling as much of that away from the hands of private interests as possible,
Right.
right? And and we've seen this with like some of the critiques from the socialist left of the stimulus, because they're sort of still thinking about politics in this kind of like spectrum way where it's like, oh, if they increase the amount of money that was spent, that would somehow make it more socialist, right? That's not necessarily the case, right? Remember, socialists are not just more liberals, right? We want to help people as much as possible immediately. So that means we're going to support things that just put people's money in people's pockets when they need money, right? But we want structural change, right? Providing rental assistance is different than public housing. One-off payments are different from wage increases across the board. targeted tax credits are different than a federal commitment to aggressively support and protect labor laws and the right to organize, utilizing the full arsenal of the state to help people in that struggle, right? Socialists are not just really liberals. We have a structural critique to how capitalism works and how it exploits us, and how we want to beat that is by pulling as much of the system of our needs away from the tyranny of the few and the powerful into the hands of the many, right? I, I talked about this on Tuesday. I think we're going to continue to try to work through this, but I just am watching this shift happening, and it's not a kind of shift that we're seeing from them where they're like now are suddenly standing up for the working class. We're just entering a different period of history in of this system in the United States. Just like the Democratic Party and the Republican Party had different initiatives and goals in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we're going to see those things develop in the 2020s and the 2030s, right? But the fundamental relationship, right, where these parties act in the interests of the ruling class and not in the interests of the working class, that has remained unchanged. We need to make sure that we're paying attention to the tactics, right, and being able to critique those while also understanding that kind of general dynamic. I just get worried because I don't want us to get outflanked again, right? Because we've seen this happen time and time again, where the logic changes, the way that they do politics changes, and the left is stuck in confusion for a decade. Our anti-austerity arguments are a great example of that. Like, we're really ready to have a conversation we should have been having in 2008, right? About like austerity and government programs and stimulus.
That's what
right now,
I mean.
you know what I'm saying?
Not to make the MMT people mad, but that's kind of what the MMT conversation feels like, right? Like an older conversation.
No, exactly. And it's just like we can't. Our theoretical advances are always going to have a bit of lag time to like the present moment. I'm just saying, like, let's not just sit back and saying like, oh, we already understand everything. It's like, no, there are developments that are changing. That doesn't mean that the class dynamics are changing, or that Biden's left wing or the stimulus program is some kind of key pathway to social democracy. We're critiquing it right here. But we're just saying, like, don't use old maps and old models. Like, understand that, this is a dynamic system, and Marxism and socialism and dialectical materialism are also dynamic systems that can respond to changes, right? And let's just understand there's shifts that are going on.
Right. And like the thing in the post game, I'll play old, when I used to do remixes of LBJ and Nixon tapes, informationer of LBJ talking to George Smathers, a Florida senator, and it goes to show, like, a lot of Democrats didn't oppose Goldwater because of the racism. It was because he was a threat to business. So Smathers is talking about how a major grocery magnate in the South is like, we can't do Goldwater's economic policies because people literally won't have money to spend in my fucking grocery stores, right? And so yes, like this, it's better than austerity, and good riddance to that era. But yeah, it's definitely something new, and I think, I mean, you'll have to educate us on like what all this era of the Fed bankrolling the stock market and corporate America, what that actually means, because it's scary.
No, and I don't want to say that like austerity has been defeated and say like we're now in like a completely new era. I'm just saying it's like, okay, obviously Republicans don't have the same ability to oppose any kind of increase in spending like they did in 2008, right? There has been a political shift, and we need to understand that that's existing. That doesn't mean that we're in a better situation. I think that's like the biggest thing that I want to make sure that people aren't mistaken what I'm saying. It's like, I'm not saying we're in a better situation at all. Sorry to be bring bad news or anything like that. I'm just saying that things are changing. We just have to always be keeping up with that.